Hey there, I'm Lance Keimig.
And I'm Chris Nicholson. We're with National Parks at Night. We teach night photography in national parks in workshops across the U.S. and internationally.
We're here today in Sequoia National Park at the invitation of the Sequoia Parks Conservancy as part of their Dark Sky Festival. We're going to be telling you about astro-landscape photography, techniques and gear, simple tricks and tools that you can use to learn this exciting genre of photography.
Today, we're going to help you get started with astro-landscape photography.
Well, what is astro-landscape photography, you might be asking? I think of it as photographing by starlight. It can be photographing for star points or star trails, but mostly it's photographing without the aid of artificial light or moonlight.
So we've got a few questions when you're planning to do astro-landscape photography, and that's, what are you shooting, where are you shooting it, and when? So we're going to cover that. First and foremost, the night sky itself can be your subject, and that is the simplest form of astro-landscape photography. And if you're just getting into it, it's a great place to start. Just focus on the night sky, focus on the Milky Way or constellations, whatever interests you, just in the sky itself, maybe mixing in a little bit of horizon and very simple foregrounds just to add context, but get comfortable shooting the stars before moving on to the next step.
And the next step would be to add a foreground. Once you're comfortable getting a basic exposure and focus and getting composed in the dark, all of which is more challenging than you might expect, then it's time to think about adding a foreground to your image. And it's important to keep in mind how the foreground relates to the background. Do they complement each other?
So where are we shooting? And one of the key things with shooting the night sky is to get someplace where you have a good night sky, right? So you want to try to get as far away from artificial light as you can. Shooting in Times Square in New York obviously isn't a great place to be shooting stars in the Milky Way. Shooting in a nice dark sky place like Sequoia National Park, that's perfect. You again, just look for spots where you can get away from city lights. It doesn't have to be completely dark, but just dark enough so that you can see a good amount of stars in the sky. And also, you want to keep in mind that you want your southern skies to be dark in particular if you're aiming for the Milky Way. Because from southeast to southwest, we'll talk about this in a little bit, that's where you're going to see the Milky Way. So you could be, out in the desert somewhere, but if your southerly view is toward Las Vegas, then your Milky Way shot isn't going to be as good as it could be if your southerly view was to someplace nice and dark. Another thing to think about in terms of when you're shooting is that moonlight is going to impact what your scene looks like at night.
And here's an example of that. This image was made during the full moon phase, and you can see that there are far fewer skies present in the image than on a dark sky night. The other thing to notice is that the color of the sky changes pretty dramatically too. If you're looking for blue sky night photographs, then you'll want to photograph in moonlight. And moonlight also can be advantageous in that it provides an illumination for the landscape that you don't get nearly as well with starlight. So not really what we think of as astro-landscape photography, more night photography or just moonlight photography, but it's very different and certainly worth exploring and investigating as well.
So when you can't just go out, any night of the year and expect to have easy access to the Milky Way, because the fact is it's in different parts of the sky in different parts of the year, and sometimes it's just not easily visible at all. So we have what we call the Milky Way season. Now, of course, the Milky Way is always there, but it's easiest to see from about March to about October. And you can see it at other times a year, but it's more difficult. You might be talking about getting up at 4 a.m. just to be able to see it for half an hour. So that's not an opportunity that we would include in Milky Way season. So again, the easiest times are March to October in the Northern Hemisphere, which I assume is where most of us live.
Okay, so just to get a grasp of what we're talking about when we're photographing the Milky Way, it's that Scutum Centaurus arm of the Milky Way that we are looking towards. It's towards the galactic center, or what we call the core. And you see in the graphic there, representation of the sun. Well, in the Northern Hemisphere, the Earth is in between the core of the Milky Way and the sun during the summertime. And in the wintertime, it's the sun that is in the center with the Earth on the outside, which is why we don't see it during nighttime hours in the wintertime in the Northern Hemisphere. Of course, everything is reversed in the Southern Hemisphere.
So as I mentioned before, the Milky Way appears to us in different parts of the sky as the year progresses. So in early spring, you're going to be looking south-southeast, and that's going to be before dawn. So remember I said before, just because you can see the Milky Way doesn't mean it's easy to access. I know people who get up in the middle of the night to prepare for a Milky Way shoot at 4 a.m, and God bless them. Personally, I prefer to shoot it before going to bed, but you can do it. So know that in the spring you can get up and look to the south-southeast and get some really great Milky Way shots. Late spring and early summer is when it's arching across the eastern sky. So the core is going to be toward the southeast, but if you've seen the Milky Way panos, which is where you get the nice arc of the Milky Way, that's something that you want to do in spring and early summer, just because you can see a lot of the Milky Way above the horizon, but it's not so high that you can't capture that arch. Once you get to late summer and fall, where we are now, you can still photograph the core beautifully, but you won't be able to get that arch anymore. And it's going to be moving. You're going to see the core in the southwest, and it's going to look pretty vertical. By the time the sun goes down and twilight's over and you can really see the Milky Way, that's when you get those photos of the Milky Way core just kind of popping vertically out of the horizon. And all these are, none of them are good or bad or better or worse. They're just different orientations of the Milky Way and different ways to photograph it. But it's good to know what they are so that you can anticipate and plan for the kind of photo that you could make when you're out shooting.
All right. And now how to go about finding the Milky Way, constellations, moon phase, other things astronomy related. There are 3 apps that I like to use. PhotoPills is one of the most diverse and comprehensive photography apps there is, and has quite a wide variety of features that you'll use for daytime and nighttime photography, visualizing the Milky Way, planning your photographs either remotely or on site before you make them. Sky Guide is a really simple and easy to use, but very detailed, basically map of the night sky. It can help you locate constellations, identify stars, and also track the movement of celestial objects across the sky. And then My Moon Phase is just what it implies. It gives you information about the moon when either current or upcoming or even past lunar phases, as well as sunset, sunrise, moonset, moonrise times, golden hour times, and blue hour times. So these are the only astronomy related apps that I use, but there's certainly a lot more of them out there.
All right, let's talk about gear. This is a big question we always get, and it's an important one to ask because you want to make sure that you're using the right photography equipment to be able to capture night photos well. So first of all, you want to use a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. And, if you're using a DSLR, you want to use a newer one. The older DSLRs are not really up to the task of shooting in low light without just an incredible amount of high ISO noise. So you want to use something relatively new. Anything made in the past, 5-6 years, you should be fine. You also want to be using a wide lens because usually, when we're shooting Astro-Landscape, we want a lot of sky in the photo. So a wide lens, and also one that's fast. And by fast, we mean, a big aperture. All of my lenses are f2.8, except for one f4 lens that I have, which is an IRIX 11 millimeter. But generally speaking, if you're going to be shooting star points, you're going to want a lens that's f2.8 or wider aperture. You also absolutely need a tripod. This is not optional equipment when it comes to night photography. You need a good solid tripod that is going to keep your camera still for very long exposures. And we're talking about exposures that could range from 10 seconds to, maybe half an hour. You need a tripod that is not going to budge, in a slight breeze or anything. So invest in a good tripod. An intervalometer is also very helpful. It's not mandatory for night photography, but if you want to do anything where you're shooting multiple images for stacking, or if you want to shoot exposures that are longer than the minimum that your camera allows, most cameras don't allow an exposure over 30 seconds unless you're in bulb mode, at which point an intervalometer becomes very useful. Also, you're going to want something for illumination. Once you get into light painting, which you'll almost certainly want to do at some point, you're going to need a dim flashlight or a headlight for seeing around, or that dim flashlight can also come into play with light painting. And also an LED light panel is a really good investment. That might be your next step in light painting, but a light panel allows you to control color temperature and color intensity a lot more precisely than a handheld flashlight. They both have their uses. Flashlight and LED panels are both useful for different things in night photography. And the more you get into it, you're going to likely want both of those in your bag.
Yeah, you might also want some bear spray or something even stronger to fend off the dinosaurs.
Yeah.
All right. So I can't stress this enough. It's really important and critical to just understand how to operate and manage your camera. That so many beginners really struggle in the field with night photography just because they're not sure of where the settings, which buttons do which functions, and how to find items in the menus. So it's really worth spending some time with your gear in the comfort of your own home in a nice bright living room to just go through it and make note of where the frequently accessed settings and buttons are, and how to navigate through the menus to find what you're looking for. It's a lot easier to do this in the dark if you already have some sense of it before you get out to shoot.
If you are going to use an intervalometer, once you get to that point, learn how to program it. That's another thing that you want to do at home. It's one of the most common questions we get on our workshops. People will bring an intervalometer, but they're not intuitive to operate. Now, that said, they're not difficult to operate. It's just that they're not intuitive. So while you're at home, before you get out into the dark, go through the manual and learn how the intervalometer is set up. The order of events for how to program it is important to understand. If the manual is not doing its job for you, then go to our YouTube page. Just go to YouTube and look up National Parks at Night. And we have a video on how to operate an intervalometer that Matt Hill put together. Now, like I mentioned before, while you're using an intervalometer, it's you're going to use it generally, for long exposures, and for for shooting star trails. So anything that involves an exposure more than 30 seconds, say I wanted to do an hour-long star trail like this one here at Crescent Meadow is a great photo that Lance shot. Lance, what was this, 90 minutes?
Yeah, I think so. That's right. It was.
Okay. So, for 90 minutes, and I positive, I wasn't standing next to you, but I'm positive that you used an intervalometer for this. So if you're going to do the long exposures, you want the intervalometer to create the star trails. Also, even if you don't have stars, if you're in a situation where you're doing light painting in an environment without the stars, if it's cloudy or whatever, you might want a 10-minute exposure. And in that case, an intervalometer is useful to have for that too. So again, anything over 30 seconds, you're likely going to want an intervalometer because it'll do a better job for you.
All right. So again, this is kind of going back to what I said before. Practice at home, prepare yourself for your shoot before you go out. Understand your gear, know how to set it up in the dark, be comfortable with it. This seems really obvious, but there's nothing worse than driving an hour to a dark location, going out and setting up, and then finding out your battery is just about to die. So a good idea to have more than one battery, and certainly just make sure that they are fully charged before you go out. And also another thing that can help you tremendously in the field is if your gear is well organized in your bag. So if everything has a permanent place, you know right where everything is. You don't have to hunt around in the dark trying to find your intervalometer or an extra battery or another memory card, because you know right where they are. You've got each lens has its own home, so you can reach down and grab the lens you're looking for without pulling them all out to see which one is which.
All right, so in terms of camera settings, number one is that we want to be shooting raw. I think, these days, most people are shooting raw anyway. I don't meet a lot of people shooting JPEG anymore. If you need to shoot JPEG for some particular reason in other areas of photography, then by all means do so. But in night photography, we are really pushing our cameras to their limits. And shooting JPEG is things are just going to get too crunchy. You want to be shooting raw, so as we're pushing the envelope of what the camera can do, we're not losing information. When we capture in RAW, we have all the information that the camera is able to capture that we can work with in post-production later. Also, kind of along the same lines is you want to be shooting manually, and that includes both exposure and focus. There is, I shoot manual in general anyway, day or night, but even there's a lot of arguments to be made for shooting aperture priority in daylight. I just don't happen to do it. But there's really no argument to be made for shooting aperture priority at night. You want full control over what your camera is doing when you're shooting in dark conditions. If for no other reason that the camera doesn't really know what to do when there's no light. The meter inside the camera is based on how much light is coming in through the lens, and there's none coming in when you're in a dark sky environment. So the camera doesn't have any accurate idea of what to do with that situation. So you need to be comfortable setting your own shutter speed and your own ISO and your own aperture for every shot. So if you're not comfortable with that yet, highly recommend just getting in that habit, even in daylight, just so you can learn how to do it instinctively. And then the same thing goes with focus. There are situations where you can autofocus at night, but there's a lot of situations when you can't. So the best practice is just to be comfortable focusing manually, and then you'll be able to focus in any situation you're confronted with.
All right, here's some other camera settings to be aware of and to make sure that you are in control of. White balance is important. A neutral setting, which typically use the Kelvin scale and set it somewhere between 3,600 and 4,000. We typically say 3,750 is a neutral dark sky white balance. If you have in camera or on your lens image stabilization or vibration reduction, it is important to turn those settings off, because they'll actually have the opposite of the intended effect when you are locked down on a tripod. And then long exposure noise reduction is a feature that will reduce noise due to heat buildup from long exposures. So if you're working in an environment where the outside temperature is, say, above 60, 65 degrees, and it's different on different cameras, but that's a kind of a general ballpark, around 65 degrees. If you're working in conditions over that temperature, consider turning on long exposure noise reduction. And note that there's also a separate high ISO noise reduction, but that only applies to JPEG files and it doesn't apply to RAW files. So no need to worry about whether that's turned on or off.
You also want to be very comfortable with looking at your histogram. So when you're working on a night exposure, you don't want to be just looking at the back of the LCD to determine whether you've nailed it or not. Use that histogram because that's going to give you a good sense of what you're actually capturing. And just like in now the night histogram is different than a day histogram. We're going to cover that in a second. But it is still important to make sure that you're not losing too much in the shadow end, and definitely that you're not blowing out your highlights. So you can use your histogram to see that if you have a highlight warning indicator on your camera, like the blinkies, we call it. You can use that. Anything along those lines. Just make sure that you're using the data that the camera can show you to determine if you've got the right exposure or not. And another thing is to turn down your LCD brightness. And the reason that we want to do that is because our eyes get adjusted to the dark, right? So when we're out at night for a few hours, we can begin to see very well because our eyes have adapted to that dark environment. And then we look at that LCD and it's very bright. So the image looks brighter to us than it really is. And it's going to fool you. If you leave that LCD brightness at the same level that it is when you're shooting in daylight, then at night, you're going to think you've got the shot, but then you get it back on the computer and find out that it's really dark to the point where trying to boost the brightness in post-production creates noise and artifacts and the photo's not looking good anymore. So the key is to turn your LCD brightness down. Different cameras have, different measurements for how they determine that. But so I shoot with a Nikon D5 and I can go in and dial it down to as much as -5. So I can go from -5 to +5. In daylight, I've got it always at 0. But shooting at night, I put it down at -4 or -5. It makes it nice and dim and gives me, when my eyes are dark adapted, that -4 or -5 gives me a much more accurate representation of what the photo is going to look like when I see it on the computer the next day.
All right. And along with that, different cameras have all kinds of different settings and adjustments that you can make to customize the camera. We're going to be using live view for composition to a certain extent, but especially for focusing. So you want to be able to find the best live view settings for your particular camera so you'll get the brightest possible image in low light. And it may take a little bit of rooting around in the camera manual to figure that out.
It's important to keep in mind that the live view settings are very camera specific in terms of using it for night photography. So we can't give one recommendation to do this. So if you're shooting Nikon or Canon or Sony or Olympus, then the advice would be different. So the advice that we do have is to check your manual. And you might even on top of that want to go to YouTube or Google, some information about the best live view settings for your camera in particular. And again, it's for shooting at night. So there are particular settings to each camera brand that make the live view more effective during night photography in dark environments.
And just a couple of quick brand specific mentions for live view settings. Sony has a feature called bright monitoring that increases the gain to the sensor and makes the image a lot brighter. So that's definitely something that you want to activate for night photography with Sony cameras. Nikon cameras, there's a way to change between still image and video live view, and the video live view settings actually are brighter. It takes a little bit more refinement than just switching over to video, but that is where you will get your brightest image. And for Canon, you want to disable the exposure simulation, which connects the live view image to the settings on the camera. And you definitely want to turn that off for Canon cameras.
When you're working at night, it's very important to have a routine. There's a lot of things that make night photography challenging, not the least of which is that it's dark out, right? So it's good. There's a lot of things to remember. So if you're working with a routine, if you have an established workflow, then you create good habits and you're always doing the same things from beginning to end. And that way you don't miss anything. So the way that Lance and I work is we're always composing first. So we get to the scene and we figure out what's attractive about that scene to us and create a composition around that. The next thing we do is focus. So once we know what we're shooting, then we make sure that we're nice and sharp. And we'll talk a little bit more about focus in a minute. Once we're composed in focus, we determine the exposure. So what's going to be our aperture and our shutter speed and our ISO? What do we need to make that scene look good? After that, we might decide if we want to add lighting or not. We don't always have to light paint at night, and there's plenty of times when we don't, but there are reasons for adding light. And at this point, I might start thinking about, does this scene need some additional light? Do I need to emphasize something or draw some detail out of some shadows? Any reason for adding lighting, this is the time when I'm thinking about it, and then when I'm figuring out how to add the light. There's no point in trying to figure out how much light I need to add or what kind of light I need to add before I've composed and focused and determined the exposure. It's only after doing that that I can start to think about those things in terms of lighting. And then finally, once we've got that all set, is rethink the process and see, do I need to make any adjustments? Now that I see a good exposure on the back of the camera and I have added light, does my composition still work? Any kind of little adjustment you might need to make. Think about that at the end. And then the final adjustment I always do, because this can be a long process from starting the composition to actually being ready to trigger the shutter for the final shot. I always check my focus again at the end. That is my final adjustment every time before I make the final shot.
All right. So composing at night. It's really the principles of design and composition are the same day or night. The main things that you want to look for at night, the things that make night photography composition difficult or challenging, is that it can be difficult to see what's in your frame, right? Especially in the corners and the edges. So it's a good idea to just go all the way around the frame, all four sides, and see if what's in your frame is what you intended to be. Is there a tree branch that's just protruding from one of the upper corners, or maybe a piece of litter or a brightly colored rock or stick or something that's distracting? So look for little details like that in the edges and the corners. And then also you want to avoid having bright spots, whether it's a light source or the moon or some bright clouds, anything that's really bright near the edge of the frame, because that will carry your eye, to that point and then out of the frame. And what you really want is for the viewer to look at the image and have their eye travel throughout the entire composition. That's our goal.
Okay, so focusing in the dark, another one of the biggest questions we get, because how do you focus when you can't see? Oh, we've talked about live view, and one of the big reason we did is because you can use it for focus. So turn on your live view with whatever settings you find are best for your camera, and see if you can find a really bright star or a planet. The planets, especially if Jupiter's out, is the brightest thing in the sky. And zoom in on that with your live view, and then rock that manual focus back and forth until it's nice and sharp. If you're in a situation where you're not focusing on the stars, if you've got foreground elements that are important, then you can also use the magnified live view to focus on that. If you don't have any light on the foreground, then you can add some light. Just shine a flashlight or go place a flashlight in the scene so that you can see your foreground in your live view while you're focusing. If you want, you could also pre-focus during daylight. That's nice and easy. I mean, you could just, while it's still light out, you could even use autofocus to just focus on your foreground subject or focus at infinity, and then turn off the autofocus and then tape it down, right? So with any of these things, just turn off your autofocus and tape down your lens to the focus that you want. Another thing you can do is, people ask a lot, well, can't I just use the infinity mark on my lens? And that's gotten a little tricky with modern lenses, particularly autofocus lenses, because the infinity mark isn't really accurate. So you could do some experimentation and some testing with your lens and find out where that infinity mark is, and then use a grease pen and just put a little mark on the lens to indicate where the infinity focus really is. But again, once you get into the night situation, if you don't want to have to refocus, then tape down that focus ring with some gaffer's tape so that it won't move and you'll be in focus all night.
All right, now we're on to the next step, and that is determining your exposure. Well, as Chris mentioned earlier, our light meters don't work very well in starlight. In fact, most don't work at all. So we're going to be relying on the histogram to determine the accurate exposure. But it's also important to remember what the three exposure variables do and how they affect your image. You can increase the ISO for more sensitivity, or decrease it to increase image quality. Aperture controls depth of field, how much of the image is in focus, and also helps to eliminate chromatic aberration, which is a distortion caused by lenses at wide open apertures. Typically, star points can look elongated in the corners and the edges of the frames on some lenses when you're shooting wide open. And then, of course, for astro-landscape photography, where you're going for stars as points of light, the shutter speed is usually the most important consideration. You want to use a short enough shutter speed that the stars are not going to appear as star trails. So when you're making your exposure calculation, for each shot that you're working on, you have to consider which of these variables is most important. And again, for astro-landscape photography, typically that's shutter speed because it controls the motion of the stars. Second is usually aperture, so you have enough depth of field for both your foreground and your background. And then lastly, ISO. You just use the lowest ISO setting that you can to get an acceptable histogram. And that's how you determine your exposure.
So during night photography, we're using the histogram as our light meter. That's how we're figuring out if our exposure is correct or not. What you're used to with the daylight histogram, throw it out. That's not going to work at night. If you're used to shooting exposed to the right, which is a common technique for daylight photography, then you're looking at a histogram that's kind of pushed to the right, and we're completely ignoring the left side of the histogram. We don't want any information there. That doesn't work well in night photography.
Well, it doesn't work well because it's not really possible. You can't get that right biased exposure and still have your stars be points of light, because we're pushing the camera to the limits of each one of those exposure variables. So look for a histogram where the left side of the data is not pushed up against the wall, the left-hand wall of the histogram. So as long as you're not clipping in the shadows and you're not going to try to push them up, push the exposure or the shadows up in post-processing, that's what you need.
The important point to remember is just that at night photography, you're not going to see what we would normally think of as an ideal histogram. So, if you've learned about that nice bell curve or triangle shape uh, to look for in a histogram in daylight, forget about that at night. You don't want it all the way pushed to the left, but you're looking at a histogram that's kind of most of the information is at the left and the shadows with the night sky, and then kind of trails off to the right.
Okay, so where do you begin with exposures if your meter is not going to give you a reading? Well, we'll tell you. For star points in a dark sky environment where you have minimal light pollution and no moonlight, ISO 6400, 20 seconds at f2.8 is kind of a standard starting point. Now, you may want to vary that depending on the conditions or the equipment that you're using. So you can use that as a starting point or an equivalent exposure. So rather than 6400, 20 seconds, 2.8, say you've got an f4 lens. Well, then you might have to go to ISO 12,800, 20 seconds, and f4. You can make an adjustment as needed based on the scene in front of you or the equipment that you've got.
Now, when we're not constrained by trying to keep our stars sharp, then we have a lot more latitude in what kind of an exposure we can use. So if we're shooting star trails, then you can forget about that 20-second limit or that relatively short limit, depending on what lens you're using. And we can shoot as long as we want, as long as we're keeping a good exposure. We could do a whole talk just on that. But suffice to say that if you want to shoot star trails, then your good starting point is ISO 800, 5 minutes at f2.8. And again, you do have latitude. So if you want to shoot 10 minutes, 30 minutes, or an hour, you just figure out what your equivalent exposure is based on reducing the ISO or closing down the aperture a little bit, etc.
All right. So you can use your star point exposure to calculate a longer exposure at a lower ISO for star trails. Now, if it's cold out, then you can do single long exposure star trails up to about 30 minutes without too much noise in the image. And by cold out, I mean typically below 50 degrees. Anywhere from 50 degrees down to, bone chilling, you're not going to have much long exposure noise. Now, if it is warm, or especially if it's hot or very, very low humidity and warm, then you might be better off combining multiple shorter exposures in post-processing. And that's typically 30 seconds up to about 5 minutes. So each exposure will be correctly and fully exposed, and then you'll combine them in Photoshop to make a longer star trail, not to build up the exposure, just to make the star trails longer.
Another thing to keep in mind with star trails is obviously the longer you have your shutter open, the longer your trails are going to be. So you can see in this representation from left to right, we see as we shoot for 10 minutes or 30 minutes or 90 minutes with a similar gear setup, the star trails get longer and longer.
And then lastly, once you've mastered these basic techniques and you've gotten to the point where you can make a pretty good exposure that's well composed and well focused, that's the time to really start thinking about adding light. And, again, this is a topic for another talk. It's detailed and complex, but it's one of the most creative and fun parts about night photography is adding light with a technique we call light painting. And that can be with a handheld flashlight or a stationary LED panel on a light stand, or even just sitting on a rock. But that's kind of next level for your astro-landscape photography. And one of the aspects of it that we both enjoy very much.
One thing to get used to with night photography is just be ready to make mistakes. Learn by trial and error. In fact, shoot by trial and error. Lance, who's been doing this for 35 years, and I've been doing it for about 10 years, we still shoot by trial and error. Don't expect to get your shot right the first time. I can think of maybe 2 times ever that I had a night shot in mind and I got it on the first exposure. And I can tell you both times I was shocked and didn't even believe it. So you're going to make mistakes. Just remember to keep working methodically. Use that, that routine that you develop, and just take it slow. Night photography is not about getting as many shots as you can. It's about working slowly and getting the best shots that you can. So stay consistent with your routine, and hang in there and stick with it when you're trying to make a shot work. Of course, there's also knowing when to quit. Sometimes at night, you've got an idea for a photo that's just not working out, and you could spend the whole night working toward a dead end, and learn to develop that instinct as well of knowing when to say uncle, saying, you know what, I thought this was a great idea, but it's just not working, and I'm going to, pack up this setup and work on something else, so I don't waste my whole night, just chasing a wild goose. Another great thing to do at night is to team up with somebody. Most people don't like being out in the dark alone. So it's one of the great things about a workshop is we can all, be out as a group shooting. But it's also really good to team up with somebody. It can make night photography a lot easier because you can help each other out, whether it's with adding light or, just being able to bounce ideas off of somebody else, or even just having somebody to talk to while you're out in the dark in the wilderness.
Yeah, and you know what, Chris, it's nice to have a partner to team up with on presentations like this. So thanks a lot for working with me on this one. It's been fun, and that's about it, everybody. You've got the information that you need to go out and make some night photographs under starlight. So there it is. That's the basics of astro-landscape photography. We hope you found this presentation useful and informative. And if you'd like to learn more about us,
check out nationalparksatnight.com. We have a weekly blog, ebooks, videos, a ton of information on learning night photography. Also, feel free to check out my book, Photographing National Parks, and Lance's book,
Night Photography and Light Painting, Finding Your Way in the Dark.
Thanks for watching.
Bye.